I want to cut right to the chase here. How do the two of you know when a piece of writing is a piece of good writing?
As editors, you mean?
Well, first of all, as editors, yeah.
To me, I feel as if when I'm reading a piece, whether it's been published or not, when I'm reading a piece of nonfiction and I'm transported into another world, and I can see the characters move around, I can hear them talk when the dialogue rolls out on the page, and I forget that I'm reading. I forget that there's a writer delivering information to me. I just feel immersed in that world. To me, that is good writing.
Victor?
Well, it depends. I mean, what we're doing here in Banff, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and I want to know where a story's going. I want it to engage me, all those things. But certainly at the Globe, where you're dealing with somewhat smaller stories, although sometimes fairly complicated, you often don't have you certainly don't have the luxury of 4 weeks to work on them. You sometimes have 3 hours when you need 8. You sometimes have 8 when you need 16. I mean, the first thing I think is just, am I able to follow the story, and is it clear and interesting? And I think you really have to decide that on a first read through. I think if it's mush and muddy on the first time through, there's 2 ways of making it clearer. To keep reading it till you finally understand it, or to talk to the writer and say, I'm not getting this. And you know, your job is, you represent the reader. You're in a kind of somewhat an adversarial position with a writer. So what I initially look for and what makes most sense, what I need is reading through it, being engaged, understanding where it's going, wherever it's going off the rails, I need to determine right away. And maybe my standards are low, but that's what I want.
How fast can you tell? I ask because I once had a chat with A.L. Kennedy, who's a young writer she was young, she's younger than me, in Scotland. She's won the Booker Prize and various other prizes. She's a very good writer. She had been on the jury of the Booker Prize. And I said to her, that's a lot of books. She's at 180 books, 220 books. How do you possibly read 220 books? And she said, well, you can tell, of course, right away. And I said, oh, well, in a couple of chapters. And she said, no. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, about 8. And I said, 8 pages. She said, no, I mean 8 lines. 8 lines. You can tell whether a book is good enough to read.
That's cutthroat. One year on
not wrong, but cutthroat.
That's right. Once on CBC, on a Sheila Rogers show on CBC, The Next Chapter, I suggested with the Giller that year, or perhaps it was Governor General. I apologize, Chief, it was. It wasn't the year you were nominated. I believe it was the Giller, though. We want to do a thing about the Giller. And I said, well, to really, get into it and read the whole book, blah, blah, it's going to be a lot, kind of heavy. Everybody's doing it. Why don't I read the first chapters and predict from just the first chapters? And producers, who of course these days are looking for easier and funner things, said, why don't you just read the first paragraph and predict? So I read only the first paragraph of the 5 books, and I predicted correctly. And the Globe had its usual 3-person panel of scholarly literary people. They didn't get it right. No. So there might be something to that. I read 4 or 5 sentences and I knew who would win.
Mm-hmm. Does that appall you, Sean?
By the way, if you read the first paragraph of her short story collection, it is a wonderful first paragraph. I read it this winter.
Oh yeah. No,
so I would have been able to tell.
Yeah.
Sorry.
As a writer, I feel offended, but as a reader, I feel as if they're maybe not in 8 lines. The first chapter in 8 pages. There's something that we can tell about the sensibility of the person behind the writing. And people in the industry like to call it voice. Agents go crazy. Oh, this book has such an incredible voice. And yet no one can really define what that is. But there's a wisdom there. Maybe there's some humor. Maybe there's some vulnerability. But anyway, there's the sense that the writer is being completely frank with their audience, and yet at the same time they're completely in control and utterly trustworthy. To me, anyway.
The reason I asked these questions is I'm fascinated by this current of feeling that's going around these days. And you see it everywhere. I mean, and every day I read somebody who says something like this, that this notion that anybody can be a writer. And that in fact, with the internet, with electronic communication, that everybody is a writer. That in fact, the idea that some people are better writers than others, and that there is good writing and bad writing is in fact on the wane. There is writing, and if people read it, that's good writing. So if there's somebody with 2 million hits on the website and old, I don't know, Seamus Heaney's only getting 50, they're better than Seamus Heaney. What do you make of that idea?
I don't know. In some ways, I mean, it's, other art forms have had this debate for a long time, right? Way more people like Madonna or Beyonce than go to a Wagner opera. And of course, people who love Wagner will say, well, they're not the same thing. And these people there's mind control going on and advertising and all those things, which there somewhat is.
There is in Wagner as well, but
that's true. That's true. I mean, I think it's an interesting question because I think in some ways the internet is making, the mainstream media confront the notion that because we now don't control the gates, we don't, you don't have to have a rich family funding a newspaper. You can have a blog. You can have, all kinds of babble going on the web. That if people get the audience, who are we to say you're getting more readers than I'm getting, and I'm at the Globe and Mail? How can I say what you're doing isn't right or isn't as good? I do think there's a lot of unedited writing out there is the problem I have. So you really have to wade through so much to get to good stuff. And I'm not saying I have to edit everything or even, everything has to be edited to within an inch of its life. But I think there's so much out there that something that is served by tradition and by editing and by asking for voice and style and sensibility and clarity is that you save people a lot of money. And but I guess also in some ways there's not that much. There are audiences these days for things beyond that. There's a lot of, I think, people who maybe teenagers or people in their 20s who weren't brought up reading kind of mainstream media things and maybe don't even expect to have clarity or speed or anything. And people can just kind of go on and on and on. They're happy to read it if it's about something mindless they like.
Charlotte, what do you?
I think I don't want to make it seem as if the only people who can be writers are the ones who graduate from journalism school or that graduate with MFAs and have this extensive training, because I have seen people learn how to write before my very eyes. I was a bad writer. I make bad sentences all the time, and I improve them. And there's something about writing on the internet that disguises the fact that good writing takes a lot of drafts, a lot of time, a lot of revision. And because it's so fast, there's a very short leap between typing something and publishing it. It quickens the whole experience of writing.
So how do you know when a good subject comes along, either for you or for a writer that you're editing at the UBC?
It's just an intuition, really.
Really?
It's just a feeling. It's just an intuition. There's something. It depends on the writer, really. I've seen people write about trips to the dentist, and they're absolutely electrifying. And then I've seen people write about car crashes and war zones, and they're completely dull. So if there's energy there for the writer, and the way that they've captured the events, the way that they've captured the idea is amusing or appealing, and it holds my attention, then it's a really good idea. But in the hands of another writer, it might be a terrible idea.
What do you find you write all the time. You're dealing with editors and story meetings and changing demands, people wanting you to write for the web more, probably at the paper. You've probably noticed a big change.
Writing for the web.
Well,
I've cultivated a reputation for incompetence intentionally.
yes, I know. I'm well aware of that. Believe me, I'm an editor at the Globe. But the pressure to do it, the difference in maybe the last 10 years, the kind of stories they want you to do,
Yeah.
are you noticing? Are they more inane? Are they less? Or do they let you come up with what you want? Is there more censorship? Not censorship, but censure if it's not what they think some kind of online buzzy audience wants?
It is true. An editor came up to me at the Globe and Mail recently and said, we were wondering if you could do a quick piece about the meaning of violence. And
How many words? Like 250 words?
I think it was 900 or 1,200 words. And I can barely say hello in 1,200 words. And I did think to myself, I wonder where that came from. And in investigating, I discovered that they had done some readership surveys, and they'd learned that violence is a subject that people will read about, that you get a lot of I think it's called clickbait. I think that's the
Yeah.
word, isn't it? Clickbait.
Yeah.
And that in fact there is more and more of this being done. In fact, that the headlines of the Globe and Mail are passed through some kind of Rube Goldberg meat grinding.
They even do a thing where they'll put a headline for 3 hours and then a headline for 3 hours, like the same story, new headline, same story, new headline, and then they'll sit us down and have us guess which headline got the best.
Yeah.
It's like we're at a game show. And then who got the best guesses, and then what are we learning from these headlines? Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't understand why every headline isn't Bieber me this, Harper is an asshole, or whatever it is you want to get them to read. Pardon my language, I beg you.
They do catch on eventually. You have to have a little variety. Yeah.
Yeah, about Harper or about Bieber?
Well, either. Yeah.
But I mean, I do not understand. I don't think you can predict what people will react to, because I don't think that. I mean, this is one of the most intelligent audiences people encounter. I don't think, with all due respect to you, that most of you know what is going to interest you before you come upon the thing that interests you, because it's a mystery what interests you. I mean, that is a deeply held religious belief on my part. It's not based in fact, it's I guess based on experience, but I do not understand this predictive, you can tell what's going to be interesting. And I think a lot of young people might laugh me out of the room for saying that you can't do that.
Well, I think a lot of really smart, intelligent consumers of media and writing in general, they also click on clickbait. I mean, I don't know how many times I've caught myself looking at dolphins swimming in circles or elephants weeping. Like we all do it. We all click on that clickbait, but it doesn't mean necessarily that we think it's a great idea.
It is, however, being used by the new, I call them the engineer editors.
The metrics, you mean?
The metrics people who are now using that to tell us what we can read.
Well, I think there is a real a kind of low level and sometimes medium level panic going on. I mean, clicks mean so much, and advertisers do want to see clicks. And there's also like on any web page of even a mainstream newspaper, there are some stories there where there's been a kind of implicit promise or hope of clicks that advertisers have been told about. Like, stories are there because we're hoping there will be clicks. And because if you click on that story, there's certain advertisers. So we're hoping people will read those. I mean, in the old days, there wasn't that pressure. And it's stunning. It's not really, we're not really deceiving anyone. It's not that we said it's the only story you can read, but it got placement up there with the other stories. And it'll, it might be about, maybe there's a small business advertiser who wants, and it's a story about the 10 big foibles of starting a small business. And that kind of thing gets clicks because it's a list. We have a certain number of readers who read that. And so we're kind of pushing it on to people because I think we need to get those clicks. Like, there are editors of the Globe now, I'm not one of them, but in more kind of businessy sections, and not the mainstream ROB section, but sub-little sections that have been created who do kind of, part of their duties is to generate a certain number of clicks on the stories they're editing. So they are assigning stories that they know will bring some kind of metric in. They're editing them in a way that are the top of the story will catch people. They're putting a headline on them for that, and they're placing them on the web page like that. And they're genuine stories. They're good stories often, but there is this kind of thing going on where we need the clicks if we're going to pay the bills. And ultimately, it changes the mix of the page, it changes what the Globe's offering, it changes how the stories are written, it changes all those things.
So how then is it different? If it's somebody at the CBC, say, on the website, or at the Globe and Mail, or at any other, fine journalistic establishment, decides to put something on the web because it's getting a lot of clicks, how is that different from a story that, this is a big issue in journalism these days amongst writers of nonfiction. How is that different from having your story sponsored by an advertiser and kind of a little bit adapting your story to what the advertiser wants? What's the difference? I mean, what you're doing is selling the page, and you're selling it in a corrupt way.
Well, are you pressured to do that at all? And have you? Like, do you have lines you've drawn, or is your line simply, don't talk to me about that?
I have, I don't think I've written a story that has been sponsored.
Have you ever found out you've written a story because, for instance, there'll be situations where, let's say, company that makes some kind of product geared at women. And I know there's been situations where they'll say, what we'd like is a pull-out section just about women who are doing well in a certain field. That's it. That's the only thing we're asking. We don't need to see the stories. We want to have our ads in there because we want women, I don't know all the reasons, psychologically connecting our ads with women doing well in certain fields. Or we think it'll just bring those eyeballs to the section. Has your stuff ever, do you know, discovered later or ever been run in sections like that where your story wouldn't have existed had the advertiser not sponsored the section? There's no pressure on you to do it. I mean, that's the thinnest edge of the wedge.
I think that might have happened, but I didn't know anything about it, and I don't think it is the thin edge of the wedge because it's no different than, I mean, if you say we've got a big story coming up and so-and-so's, you know, Victor's written a great story about grammar, it's a 10,000 word story, it takes up the whole section.
That's a totally different thing. That would just obviously be a good story.
Come on, Anna.
No, but it is different because in the old days you'd have a story, meaning you decide what is newsworthy. Now that's influenced. We need to come up with 7 stories about women who are doing well in science and the arts. Right. So those stories wouldn't have been in the paper without it. So I'd say it is a thin edge because it's influencing the story lineup.
And what I was talking about is a company saying, I want 3 pages of great writing.
Yeah.
And I just want to put my name on it.
Right.
I don't think that's influence, is it?
Okay.
Well, do you?
I don't know, do you?
Did they ever ask for, all we want is great writing?
No,
They don't give you any more direction.
Isn't that then just
you
then
wouldn't
coming?
do it if they asked for any direction. If they said, if they showed up in your office, you'd tell them to go to hell.
Right.
And you wouldn't write the story.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, I mean, there are all kinds of levels, and right now the big one is this branded content, which is content that kind of is connected to a brand, and some people feel not clearly enough demarcated from the regular stuff. But then there's all kinds of layers in between that.
The issue is that the Globe and Mail, the managers, the publisher, and the owner want to be able to tell a journalist to change the story to satisfy the publisher. And I think if you do that, you're no longer a newspaper. I mean, the Globe and Mail is 140 years old. They've been allegedly developing a brand of independence, and you can actually read it thinking that maybe it speaks for itself.
And have you
and
thought...
they want to give that away for 20 cents?
See, you're like a name at the Globe. I'm, as all editors are. I've taken my vow of anonymity. You, as Gay Talese called it, your name is kind of... You have a lot invested in your name. If it in fact becomes the case that we get a contract that says you have to write branded content,
I'd leave. Yeah. I guess the question I wanted to ask before we got distracted, was how much responsibility do they have as readers? I mean, maybe they shouldn't be clicking on bait. Maybe you should think about the consequences of that. Maybe they should, stand up for the independence of, as opposed to just give in to that oozy, if I might coin a word, masturbatory feeling of just doing what's there in front of you. I mean, do you think the reader has a responsibility to the production of great writing?
Well, either they continue to read the paper and just click away, or they go to another news source. I mean, there are plenty of other outlets that don't really, they still print news. And, I've moved around quite a bit in the last couple of years, just looking for news from around the world, which seems harder and harder to get in Canada. Mm-hmm. I think people are very versatile and flexible when they're reading their news.
Mm. I want to change the subject. What made you want to be a writer? Do you remember, was there a particular piece of work, an instance that you remember?
Well, I decided I wanted to be a writer pretty young, so I don't ever remember having other aspirations. And I think probably many writers have that sense, even if it's kind of retroactive, that really there was something about storytelling that they really liked, or there was something about seeing the world in that way, so that ideas are very closely attached to the words that you write. In a way, it's almost as if you don't have the thoughts before you write them down. So to me, the two things were really married together really early, and I think I became an adult thinking to myself in that way, even if it took a long time to learn how and to get published. As I think a great many writers, there's plenty of writers in the audience I know, it takes a long time to get good, it takes a long time to get published, and there's a difference there between knowing you want to do it and finding some purchase in the world that way.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, it sounds like you're saying it has to be its own reward for you to really take on the hugeness of the
Everyone's
hill.
different, I think. Some people have really incredible stories that they know they want to tell. Like they're just bubbling to get out of them, and they just start making sentences, and before they know it, they've got pages and pages.
Mm-hmm. What made you want to do it?
Well, really, I don't write all that much. I mean, mostly I edit, and I really became an editor, I hate to say it, but kind of to pay the bills. I mean, I had finished university, as you mentioned, it was in social and political thought.
At York.
There just weren't that many jobs. At York, you
York,
keep pointing
a
out.
very fine university, York University.
And my BA's from Queens. He is, by the way, just a general BA from the University of Toronto. How embarrassing is that? But no, it was, I mean...
It's not York, that's for
sure.
sure.
It seemed like a great job, and it was a great job. But it is funny all these years later. It's like I've been editing for a long time, and I do love the job, and there's a lot of interesting stuff, and I love working with writers, and I mean, compared to so many jobs, it's a wonderful job. It really is. But there are days you just think, can you not just write this clearly in the first place? Like, you know, why do I have to edit you? How many times have I edited you? How many times have we been through this? I know people are on deadline, and that's a big issue more and more. I think our writers are writing for the web, they're writing 24/7, they're writing, you know, blogs they're often under pressure to do, they're writing for us, they're writing features. You know, we've downsized twice in the last few years, again, because people are clicking on, you know, Huffington Post top 10 cutest dogs, and our advertisers want clicks. And so I'm getting work from very, you know, pressured people, and I'm having to edit it under more pressure circumstances. In some ways it's been fun because I'm doing more than I've had to do, and I'm having to do it in a different way. But there are days, yeah, you just think, just write it in English, write it clearly, say what you're going to say you've said it, say you've said it, and let's publish it. But it just is unending, you know, the need for editing, which keeps me so far in business.
Mm-hmm. Do you think people are needing less editing, and are they responding to it? I've heard that people resist editing more now.
You know, it just depends. I think there are more cases where their fuses are shorter because they're so busy and they just don't have time to be edited. And, you know, it's always been the situation, probably everywhere, but certainly at the Globe, where a story will have one idea from some higher up, and then it morphs at a story meeting, and then a poor writer gets it who didn't even want it, or some other writer thought of it, but they're too busy. Someone stuck writing it, it gets edited by someone else, it gets bumped out of the focus section because they didn't have room, and it comes to arts, and I get it, and I think it should be something else, and, you know, there's just some kind of meltdown happens. I think more, you know, that happens occasionally. I find more often now it's people are just thrilled if you're willing to edit them because they don't have time sometimes to do it properly. And it is their byline, it's your byline on there. I'm anonymous. So they're happy that I, you know, have saved them often.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the days are over for my favorite kind of story? I'm reading, I see something, I pick it up, I start reading a story, it's beautifully written, but it can be about anything. And I'm there for hours. You know, 3 hours go by and I've read 40,000 words, 50,000 words, 70,000 words on oranges, just because it happened to be told by a very skillful storyteller, in that case, John McPhee. But do you think that's gone now?
No, it's not gone. And anyone who's got a subscription to a website like Longreads or any of these other ones, there are so many long-form journalism pieces out there floating around, and there are people reading them. But we're in an industry that's going through a giant convulsion right now, and it's almost difficult to see because we're right in the middle of it. People don't want to pay for their reading material, and there's no real way yet to monetize it. Because the old models are desperate failing, you know. So until everybody gets that all figured out, I think it's going to feel quite stressful to anyone who publishes this stuff or writes it. The money, if anyone's a freelancer, the money has really just taken a nosedive to the point where you can't invest the time anymore. You have to go and do other things in order to make a living because they're so infrequent, those paychecks. So at worst, I think a whole generation of people will be discouraged from taking on those kinds of projects. But I think we've always told stories and we'll always continue to tell stories. They just may not be in the form that we're used to.
Although I do think there is, I mean, you said earlier, should readers be responsible for a lot of the pablum that's out there? I do think, I lament how many probably great stories aren't being told now because people can't afford to tell them. You know, if you're doing it for 10 cents a word when you used to get $1 or 75 cents, and you know, that can happen. Like a great magazine like Maisonneuve. You know, some of our writers have been published in it, and it looks beautiful, and they win a National Magazine Award, but they have to live with the fact that they're going to get almost nothing per word to do it. And, you know, so but they had the help of Banff. But if you don't have a patron and you don't have the money, you know, I think there's lots of stories just evaporating. And when you combine that with kind of the pressure on mass media to please advertisers, you do, I think, get, you know, this real diminution of great investigative things happening. Investigative broadly, like all our 8 writers are basically doing investigative work, and investigative like Watergate, where things slip through.
A patron is an interesting idea. You mean an individual patron? Like
if you have one, I mean,
Machiavelli and the, you know, Lorenzo, giving him some dough so he could write that
kind of thing, the
little thing he
Medici.
wrote.
Yeah. Or, I mean, it's interesting how many people I've worked with who have rich husbands or rich wives. You know, it's not unusual for people at the Globe to have and it could be a coincidence, but they have a high-power lawyer husband, they have an investor husband, they have, you know, those people, they're people who are reported on an ROB, and then these people have the luxury of writing about things that otherwise, you know, they never would be able to, whether it's visual arts or architecture or investigative stuff. But a lot of, I find, maybe it's like that everywhere, but there's a lot of people who actually have some other source of income in a relationship who are able to do it anymore. Not, you know, not always, but sometimes, I think. Yeah, or people from rich families.
Do I have a rich husband?
Is that how do you have a rich husband?
Not the last time I checked.
It's easier to have someone write about what they know, as opposed to finding out what we need to know, because it is very expensive, for sure. I mean, I want to single out the Globe. I think in news sections, that is somewhat the way.
Yeah. I mean, I'm writing 2 memoirs because there are subjects I want to write about. And one of them may not turn out to be a memoir so much as an investigation of age, of a certain age, which would be an investigated subject. And what Victor says is right. There's a lot of that, you know, get them to, I mean, Christy Blatchford is a good example of this. You know, Blatchford is a very good reporter. I mean, she's like she has a bulldog and is a bulldog. I mean, and a lovely bulldog. You know, just like a, she's a threshing machine, you know, like that, intellectually, and just sucks it in and can stream it out. But she is often asked to put a personal spin on things, and so, you know, you get those things she does where she goes, he was but a boy, but a boy. You know, that she wrote for 6 months. Every 5th sentence was but a boy.
Or and about her bulldog, she's written quite a bit.
She's written about her dog. She's written about her father. You know, in perhaps not what one would call investigative ways. I guess it is a bit of a follow. But you know, these are writers too. They write about what they want to write about. It's and you know, I don't know, the New Yorker in the magazine. I mean, the blog I find suffers, but they pay $250 for a blog, no matter who writes it. Calvin Pullen, $250. Seymour Hirsch on the blog, $250. In the magazine, they pay $3 a word. You know, right? You write a 5,000 word piece, that's $15,000. You can live for a couple of months on 15 grand.
I was shocked last year when Calvin Trillin was here, and I don't think he said it when we were in the public event, but he wrote a piece. He normally gets, I think, $9,000 for a 3,000 word piece, or 12,000 or something. Yeah. And they looked at it and they said, no, it's not for the magazine. We'll put it on the blog maybe. He said, what do I get for the blog? $250. A Calvin Trillin, same piece. They just don't budge. And I definitely noticed that on the blog. It's just not the magazine. And I think, again, it's that phenomenon. They're wanting people to do volunteer work. I mean, I've said that to people, excuse me, this cough, at work. I'm sometimes asked to, you know, work extra hours and do stuff because we're short-staffed. And what I've said to editors above me there is, I like to restrict my charitable giving to nonprofit organizations. But as writers, I think you really see it. It's sort of like you're lucky to be, you know, printed, and, you know, people can't live on luck. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so you don't, and then I think there's a step up even with the investigative stuff, because that's hard stuff. And it's very hard to do freelance if you don't have someone backing you, because there's all kinds of legal issues when you're going after powerful people.
Charlotte, I'd be interested in hearing your answer to that question, though.
I think it's a false dichotomy between memoir and investigative journalism, because there's, you know, the genre is gigantic, and if someone is present in the story, that doesn't mean they're not investigating. It doesn't mean they're not doing any hard research. There are memoir pieces that are completely deep and thorough and very informative. And then there are investigative pieces that are, light as air. So in a way, I feel like it's a spectrum, and these ways of writing are always sort of blending in with each other, and they're just modalities, and sometimes you need one, and sometimes you need the other. I know I spent a whole year doing research, and going through conifer reproduction textbooks, and it's a memoir. So I didn't feel like I was writing a memoir at that point, but the publisher's got to slap a label on it somewhere so they know where to put it in the bookstore, or they know what to label it when it's published in the magazine.
Which is not to say that there's not a great need for intensive reporting. But it's hard to get 3,000 words in the Globe and Mail. I practically have to marry Julie Travis.
Right.
And
Did she ask you?
no, she's not my type. But she's a lovely person and smart, but she.
You're already married too, you know that, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm already married, yeah. But for an extra 1,000 words, I'd do anything, I'd commit bigamy for that. But you have no idea how difficult it is. To get 2,500 words, which in any investigation that you're going to actually want to read has to be told a bit as a story, and therefore it needs a little extra space for a few scenes, a little character development, whatever you throw in there. Several years ago, Pete Power, the photographer, and I had said, "Why don't you send us up north for 2 months in the summer, when it's habitable, and we will do planes, trains, and automobiles across the north. We will take every known means of conveyance to get from one end of the high Arctic through to the other." And they said, "That's a great idea, but it's too expensive, we can't go." So I think it was in November, Sinclair Stewart, who's the managing editor, brilliant guy, a classic news editor type, sort of deeply autistic, speaks in a kind of
Said that.
in telegraph style, I keep, every time I see him, I remember that great thing that Robert Benchley, that he was supposed to be writing a news story for about Venice, and we got to Venice, and Benchley would like to live. He had dinner, he had a couple of drinks, took a couple of days off before he started writing. And he sent a telegram to the editor of the New Yorker that said, "Arrived Venice. Streets full of water, please advise." I just thought that was, every time I see Sinclair Stewart, I think of him. I think of that because he's sort of like that. But anyway, he said to me at one point, "Would you like to go to the Arctic and for a month with a photographer and write a piece?" And I said, "How long?" He said, 4,000 or 5,000 words. Something like that, but you can go for a month. I said, "Well, how are you going to send me?" Because, the Globe is losing money, right? It's a terrible situation. And I said, "How are you going to send me?" And he said, "Well, we got the profits off. We did a kind of one of these sponsored things, right? Like a branded content piece for a bunch, and we insisted in sales that we get part of the profit so that we can finance some Arctic journalism because it's so expensive." And I said, "Well, where do you want me to go?" He said, "You can go wherever you want. All I want is for you to get frostbite. No, he didn't say frostbite. He said, I want you to get snow blindness, because I want you to really feel, I want a sense of the there of the place, if there is a there of the place." And he started talking about Moby Dick and whiteness and all this kind of thing. But he's a good editor, right? And if he says, here go. But what I couldn't figure out was where the money came from, because 50 grand for flights, that never happens. So I knew something had to be up. And I said, is it branded content? Is it custom content? Is it native content? Is it whatever the hell they call it? There's 75 different names for it. It's like newspeak, in Orwell. But he finally said, no, it's actual free cash, it's profit, it's dedicated to this, and you can go and do that. And I said, and I get to write what I want? And he said, absolutely. So we went, I don't know, we had 12, 15, the stack of stuff I had, the notebooks alone are like that. And, it's unbelievable. For 5 weeks in the Arctic in November. It's the most inhospitable place it's even more inhospitable than Golden. It's unbelievable place. Just cold and hideous, and the people hate you, right? I mean, you're a white journalist, and you go to an Inuit guy, you say, I'd like to talk to you, and he just looks at you like, you are an insect, get away from me. It's unbelievable. And you can't go anywhere. You sit you find, you're walking, and you're so cold, you think, skidoo, great, fantastic, skidoo, I could actually get on this, I'll get there in 5 minutes. You get on the skidoo, your ass is so cold. You go 50 miles an hour, you're frozen in this position for about an hour, you can't do anything. But all that stuff sort of adds up and becomes very, very interesting on top of all this. There's so many issues, and everything is so stark that everything has bearing. Everything has gravity. It has, there's something at stake. If it's somebody walking down the street, with his hat off, there's something at stake. And so it's great. But many people have come up to me at the Globe and said that was a sponsored piece. Sinclair Stewart is not a liar, and he's.
I think there might be some. I actually don't know how the North thing happened. I think there was an advertiser. Maybe it was one of those situations where I would love to have some stuff on the North. Period. I don't care anything beyond that. I'd love it to be good, but I'm not sure. Because it is odd how money percolates up there sometimes. Like you think, I thought we had no money, and then money comes. And I'm saying in very completely honorable ways. There is still budgets for funny things if they decide it's important. So it might have just simply been that, and other people assumed it must be sponsored.
Well, the new editor claims that that they asked for a piece on the North, but the editor who commissioned it said they did not. That he went to them and said, "I've got a piece on the North. You're GE. You sell giant generators. You want to do a lot of business in the North. Would you like to slap your name on this? And it's our content," and they did. And now they rerun it. They have this thing called evergreen content, and and now it's, like the Mac's Corner Store is advertising on the Arctic piece. I mean, God forbid if they should go up there and try and sell things. Can you imagine going to the Arctic?
I'm going to
Although,
jump in.
I mean, as it.
He's just started.
Sorry.
I would invite all of you to follow all three of our guests to Math
Sorry.
Lab
Especially him. Yeah.
to continue the storytelling over a drink. I would like to thank our guests this evening, Charlotte Gill, Victor Dwyer, and of course Ian Brown. Give them a round of applause.